With true crime, everything has to be true. What you know about the people, you have to get from investigating. You have to get from interviewing. It has to be correct. Unlike fiction, where nobody really knows except you whether it's true or not. This is the first time in history that anyone has been accused, charged, or convicted with bleach as a murder weapon. Probably been 10,000 people ask me why she did it. I tell each and every one of them, it's in the book.
This podcast is part of the Blueberry Network, where listeners and podcasters come together. Find out more at blueberrywithnoease.com.
The Eat, Sleep, Write podcast is brought to you by generous grant from the Built on Dreams Media Network, with additional funding by the Sims Media Foundation, and from the generosity of listeners like you.
Stand by, please. Rolling on 6. On 6.
Welcome to episode 44. If you enjoy the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast, or if you had your own success in writing, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me about yourself and your story, and I may get back to you and have you as a guest on the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast. If you have any questions or comments, anything at all, please write me. The email address is comments@eatsleepwrite.net. Thanks for leaving me a short message about the podcast. I really do appreciate it. Once again, the email address is comments@eatsleepwrite.net. I'm delighted to welcome John Foxjohn, author of Killer Nurse, the harrowing true story of one woman's murder spree in an East Texas town. John Foxjohn, author of Killer Nurse, welcome to the Eat, Sleep, Write podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Kimberly Signs, the Killer Nurse. Were you able to interview her?
I interviewed a few of them, but not many. The problem was that most of them I talked to during the trial, and they told me they would talk to me afterwards, but of course, that's before she was convicted. And afterwards, they only wanted to talk to me if I would write that she was not guilty, which I couldn't do.
What were some of the unusual incidents at the trial?
One of the huge things that happened during the trial, and you don't hear this very often, the judge ended up calling the defense attorney dishonest, told him he had lied to the court many times, things like that. That was just one of the things that happened that was kind of unusual. Another thing that, and it's not in the book, the wife of the defense attorney sat in the courtroom, and at one time she called a young lady that come in the courtroom a bitch right during trial.
You just mentioned that the judge called the defense attorney dishonest. This must have stopped the courtroom dead in its tracks.
The defense attorney secretly recorded a conversation with Dr. Nazir, who was the head of the DeVita Dialysis Center, when he had agreed that no recording was going to take place. After he got Dr. Nazir on the stand, he tried to use the recording that he had agreed wasn't going to happen, and then tried to tell the judge that he didn't know that it was actually recorded. The judge was just livid. That's just one of many times, though, that the defense attorney got himself in trouble with the judge.
The defense attorney was stretching things beyond all bounds of normal operation.
He wasn't playing fair at all.
How long did it take you to write the book?
The actual writing took me 5 weeks. Editing and everything that came afterward took quite a bit longer. There's a huge difference between true crime and writing fiction, which I've always done.
Tell us more about the difference between true crime and fiction writing.
In fiction, the writers sit down and they create a character from the ground up. Everything about that character you invent. A mad scientist in a lab creating Frankenstein, you just create everything about him.
This is your first true crime novel. Was it difficult for you to transition from writing fiction?
I didn't know it until I got in. I had to work with the editor at Berkeley. Then I had to work with all the lawyers to clean up language in the book. Nobody could get sued. With true crime, you don't have that capability. Everything has to be true. What you know about the people, you have to get from investigating. You have to get from interviewing. It has to be correct. Unlike fiction, where nobody really knows except you whether it's true or not. In true crime, if you call them a liar, they have to be a liar. If you say they lied on the stand, they have to have lied on the stand.
So all your facts have to be corroborated?
Yes, it has to be corroborated.
Otherwise, it's out the door.
Right. If I write something in there, it has to be true.
What made this case so difficult?
This is the first time in history that anyone has been accused, charged, or convicted with bleach as a murder weapon. One of the huge problems that the prosecution had, bleach doesn't stay in the blood. Once it hits the bloodstream, it automatically becomes attached to all the parts in the blood, and it's invisible. She was charged with 5 murders and 5 attempted murders. They believe that she may have committed as many as 19. They only charged her with what they thought they could convict her of.
An old adage, a good trial lawyer never asks a question in the courtroom that he doesn't already know the answer to.
Yes, that is true. That also happened during this one.
In what way?
The defense attorney had brought in a patient from DeVita and had her on the stand. And it just happened that this patient had been a nurse for 18 years before she developed kidney disease and became a dialysis patient. He asked her if she had ever seen Kimberly Sign, if she had ever seen her do anything wrong. She answered no, she had never had. Then the prosecution asked her why hadn't she ever seen anything, and she said that she was legally blind.
This was a seriously complicated case.
It was a very complicated case.
Did you get to interview the jury?
I spent almost 8 hours talking to the jury. I was fortunate enough to get them all together. We discussed everything on tape for about 8 hours.
When you're listening to people talk about a true crime story, is it difficult for you to translate what they're saying into words? I mean, you have to take all this investigative material, color it, shape it, and make it into a form that a reader can understand clearly.
It really is. You have to inject things around the character. What's going on in the courtroom? The tension, what people are feeling there, the smells, the sights, the sounds, all this is very important. What's going around our characters? It's the facts, but you want to interject what's going on around it, how everything affects the spectators.
Is it hard to do that?
It's extremely hard. I was told when I first started this, and I'd never written a true crime before, but my agent told me, write it like a murder mystery. I've written a bunch of murder mysteries, but I didn't know how to take the real facts and make it into a murder mystery.
What was your first reaction when your agent said to you, write it as a murder mystery?
My first reaction was, how do you do that? I really didn't know. I spent 3 years learning how to write true crime. I read a lot of true crime and I had a lot of help from other people who had written them. One of the interesting things, my agent had told me, start with the murders. True crime has to start with the murders. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, I got 5 of them, 5 attempted murders. Which one do I start with? Where do I start? Where do I not? I really didn't have a clue.
I can't help but think when your agent told you to write this as a murder mystery, your first reaction really was, they must have a screw loose on top.
Yeah, I did, actually, because I had no clue.
Tell me more about your book, Killer Nurse.
For months, the DeVita Dialysis Center had a really high number of deaths and injuries occurring. In April alone, they had rushed 34 patients to the hospital. Kimberly Signs was a well-liked vocational nurse there. She was a mother. She was 34 years old. She was a mother of 2, married from East Texas. On April the 1st, they had 2 patients die. It's very rare that dialysis patients die while hooked up to the machine. It's so rare that when the 2 of them died within 5 minutes apart, DeVita instigated their own investigation of the entire facility. On April 28th, 2 patients came forward and said they saw Kimberly Signs inject patients with bleach.
Did you ever get an answer as to why she committed these murders?
Yes, I did. A lot of people don't know this. Motive does not have to be proved in a murder case.
Why did she commit these murders?
Probably been 10,000 people ask me why she did it. I tell each and every one of them it's in the book.
What do you like best about being an author, and what do you like least?
I'm a mean boss, and I don't give myself a lot of time off. I just like being able to create things, usually in fiction, tell a story. The biggest thing that I'm not fond of in writing really doesn't have to do with the writing process, has more to do with the self-promotions that writers now have to do. I spend a whole lot of time promoting my work than I actually do writing.
Yet you do understand the concept of self-promote or die.
I do, yes.
Who or what inspired you to become a writer?
When I was 12 years old, I read a book about Crazy Horse, the Lakota war chief. I said then that I was going to write a book about Crazy Horse. It took me about 40 years, but I did. That's when I decided I wanted to write.
During that 40-year span, when did you start writing?
I was a police officer for a whole bunch of years. That is the start of my writing. You have to do a lot of reporting there. Hopefully not all of it's fiction.
You were a homicide detective for 10 years, leading to very detailed work and very detailed writing of reports. With your years as a homicide detective, it seems clear that if anybody had an understanding of the right questions to ask and how to get information out of people, approaching a true crime book, you were the perfect choice.
Yes, absolutely. The biggest thing that comes from police work to writing is interviewing. This helped me out tremendously with Killer Nurse, gathering information on it, leading up to the writing. It also helped me walk in, talk to the police, to the DA. I was comfortable doing this, and it wasn't something where I was timid and afraid. Police and the investigators and I had some real good conversations about what was going on and what they could tell me and what they couldn't tell me. A lot of it happened after the trial because they had a gag order.
Coming back to your background again, you must have felt great excitement at knowing that you had this story bagged and in your corner.
It was, but as a police officer, I know that you don't have this in your corner. You build a case by working. I interviewed 237 people. A lot of these, I may have got a sentence or two out of them that actually went in the book. Little pieces here, little pieces there. It's like building a case. You just get these pieces and you start putting them together.
You have to listen to snippets of conversations.
People sometimes have the tendency to freeze up when they know they're on the record. Sometimes when they're just getting started, when police are interviewing people, the biggest giveaways come right at the beginning or right at the end.
Your career as a homicide detective really set you up perfectly to cover this story.
I was the perfect person to write this story.
What advice would you give to writers just entering the field?
Learn how to write. Some people are born to be artists. People are not born to be writers. You have to be made into a writer. Get in there, learn the craft.
How about an excerpt from your book?
Yes. It wasn't until Harrington finished the first part of his closing argument and turned the podium over to the defense attorney that he seemed to become tense. Ryan Deaton's reputation among his adversaries on the prosecution side was that he might misrepresent facts, and Harrington was bracing himself for it. Deaton's athletic physical appearance and his young age contrasted sharply with Harrington. Deaton had a fashionable 3-day growth of hair on his face and stood a few inches over 6 feet with wide shoulders. There was a permanent scrape mark on his forehead just above the bridge of his nose. His shaved head, an apparent attempt to conceal early male pattern baldness, stood out, especially in the afternoons with a 5 o'clock shadow. Deaton's shaved head did more than hide his lack of hair. When he got angry or upset, a bright red splotch about 4 or 5 inches in diameter appeared on the left side of the back of his head, a dead giveaway that things weren't going his way. As Deaton began his closing arguments, something occurred that left an indelible impression. An owl hooted a couple of times just outside the courthouse window. Deep East Texas is steeped in tradition, and in some cases superstitions. one of which is that hearing the hoot of an owl during the day means imminent death. It's a superstition not only confined to East Texas. Many other